Hello, my name is Ed Purdy. I have been a docent, a guide at the Abbie Gardner Historic Site in Arnolds Park, Iowa. And I'd like to share with you some stories about something that happened back then that I think you'll find amazing and interesting. It started for the heroine of our story, Abbie Gardner, in 1843 in a little town in upstate New York called Twin Lakes, when Abbie was born. Remember lakes. She was born in a town called Twin Lakes. Abbie's father was an adventurous type. He loved to be on the cutting edge of things. He was interested in the frontier. And back then, one of the things that you could do to improve yourself and also to have adventures was to go to the frontier, to go west. And that was the quest that a lot of people had, and Abbie's father decided to do that. Within a space of about 2 years, Abbie was 10 at the time when they started to move out west. They made the trek through Ohio, spent some time in Illinois, and then crossed the Mississippi River into Iowa. They stayed for a short period of time one winter in northeast Iowa in Shell Rock, and then they made their way to Clear Lake, where they built a log cabin, and they stayed there about 1 year. While they were at Clear Lake, they had a little scare. There was some Native Americans that came and stole some chickens, and there was no bloodshed at that time, so they were aware that in the frontier there was a lot of opportunity, but there also could be some danger. In spite of that, Abbie's father, Roland, decided to go even further west. So they made their way across the prairie. And by the way, Abbie, in her book that she wrote, describes the prairie as being an incredibly beautiful place with prairie grass, big blue stem mainly, 6 feet tall, extending in hundreds and hundreds of miles in every direction. She describes the prairie flowers as sparkling like the stars in the sky. And she describes the ducks and the geese and the swans existing in such numbers as to literally block out the sun. And so in July of 1856, they arrived at a beautiful place called, at that time, all of those lakes in this area were called Spirit Lake. They thought it was all connected, evidently. But again, from Twin Lakes to Clear Lake to Spirit Lake, there's certainly a tendency there, and we know that Abbie's father, Roland, loved lakes. They arrived on a knoll by what is now West Okoboji, and can you imagine slowly going up that knoll in 2 covered wagons that were powered by teams of oxen, and then looking for a place to build their log cabin. And they looked around for 2 or 3 days, couldn't find a place better than where they originally arrived, and so they set about building their cabin. At the time they arrived, there were no other settlers in that area. They were truly pioneers. And can you imagine being all on your own? No streets, no grocery stores, no doctors, no means of communication with the outside world. That family was all on their own. But they were pioneers, and so they persevered. So the cabin was constructed, and Abbie describes the winter in the cabin as being very, very pleasant. They would have school lessons, they would play games, and of course, they would do the daily chores. In the cabin, by the way, which was rather small compared to the size of our houses today, were the following people in Abbie's family: her mom and her dad, Roland and Frances, and her older sister, Mary, who was married, her husband, Harvey, and their two children, two small children, Abbie's younger brother, and Abbie. So there were 9 people that lived in that cabin all through the winter. It was a very, very severe winter. And so they were much looking forward to the spring so they could start planting their crops and having their life. In the meantime, we can talk about another group of people. And this group of people will be very, very important to the story of Abbie Gardner. And they are the Native Americans. As you probably know, the Native Americans had been on this continent for at least 10,000 years. They had developed cultures and they had lived off the land for the most part as hunter-gatherers. There were some that were involved in agriculture. They had been pushed back with the coming of the European settlers. And so at times there was bad feelings between the two groups. Specifically, the leader of this group of Indians that we will find out enter into Abbie Gardner's life was a leader called Paduta. And Paduta had what is described as either a brother or a cousin or someone that was very close to him. We don't know for sure. He was the chief of that band of Indians. His name was Sindamindadota. Now, my name is Ed, and I kind of like my name. But on the other hand, Sindamindadota has quite a ring to it, doesn't it? And so they were, again, as I mentioned, quite close. However, a European settler killed Paduta's brother or whatever relationship he may have had. And if someone kills someone close to you, of course, you are, in all likelihood, going to be at least angry or perhaps even a stronger emotion. After Sindamindadota's death, Paduta then became a leader of this band of Dakota Sioux. And in the wintertime, they would spend the winters from year to year at a little settlement called Smithland, Iowa, which was southwest of what is now Sioux City. Not exactly certain what happened. They had had friendly relationships with the pioneers there at Smithland, but in the winter of 1856-57, very severe winter, food was growing short, and one of the stories is that the Native American women were gathering field corn, waste corn, and trying to get something to nourish themselves. The pioneers did not like that. Some issues occurred, and the pioneers then basically destroyed the Native American village, took their rifles, took their guns, their muskets, and basically evicted them from the area. Now, that was something of a death sentence for the Native Americans. They used those weapons to gather food, elk or deer. And so obviously that would further make someone angry, as you can understand. After that happened, the Native Americans made their way up the Little Sioux River. On the way up the river, they encountered a few pioneer cabins, which they ransacked and took the weapons, and further made their way up the Little Sioux River at a little settlement, basically one log cabin at the time, called Gillett Grove. Mr. Gillett, who was the owner of that cabin, noticed that one of Paduta's braves was wandering around by his cabin. He took exception to that, picked up his musket, and shot this Native American and killed him. And so again, try to put yourself in the shoes of those people and the tribulations that they were having. They then arrived, the band of Dakota Sioux, in the Spirit Lake vicinity, the Okoboji vicinity now. And they had spent quite a bit of time there in the summers. And here were some intruders. After the Gardners had constructed their cabin, there were 6 other pioneer families that had cabins constructed. And if you can, again, place yourselves in their shoes, it was like perhaps the analogy might be if you were away from your home for a while and come back, and basically there's somebody that has built another house in your backyard, and that would not be real attractive for you. And so these 2 groups of people came together then on March 8th, 1857. The Native Americans entered the cabin. They asked for food. Mrs. Gardner fed them some pancakes. They left for a while. That particular time was in the morning. In the evening, they came back and they shot Abbie's father. Put yourself in the place of a 13-year-old girl, Abbie Gardner. She saw her father killed, her mother, her niece, and her nephew, and her little brother. They took Abbie captive, and why they did this, we're not particularly sure, but it may have been caused by the background that I just described. Abbie was taken captive, and she was held captive for almost 3 months as they made their way out to Dakota Territory. While she was captive, she was required on the way out, marching across the prairie, to carry a pack that weighed about 80 pounds. Abbie, in her book, says that there were bars of lead in it, buffalo robes. And this was walking, by the way, not on a city street or in a school hallway. This was walking up and down ravines and through creeks that she waded where the water, cold water, was waist deep. And the food that she was provided was their leftovers, and a lot of it was rancid and almost rotten. And so it was a very, very trying experience for Abbie Gardner. But one thing that she did was that she persevered through all of this, and that will become even more apparent in just a little bit. On the way out, she also experienced 2 things that, again, would have been very traumatic for a 13-year-old girl or for anybody. The Indians, Native Americans, had taken 2 other captives, 3 others actually, but one of them was rescued. The other, an Elizabeth Thatcher, who was 19, they were going over the Big Sioux River, trying to get across it on a dam, as she called it, basically kind of a bridge made up of a lot of branches and logs that have lodged in that place. As Elizabeth was about halfway across, the Native American, reports are it was Paduta's son actually, pushed her in the river. And the river was swift, and the water was high, and it was cold in March. And Elizabeth tried to swim to one side, and she made it, and they forced her back in the river. She swam then to the other side, trying to survive, and they pushed her back in the river, and swam she did to one more side, all the while being carried downstream, and the Native Americans then shot her and killed her. Abbie Gardner, 13 years old, saw all of this. Later on, Lydia Noble, who was another captive, was asked by, again, probably Paduta's son, to come out of the teepee where she and Abbie were located. And Lydia Noble had had enough. She was a strong-willed person, and she refused. And unfortunately, she was killed again in front of Abbie's eyes. Then luckily, the Indian agent in Minnesota had arranged to have 3 friendly Native Americans to try to go rescue Abbie Gardner. And in fact, they did. They found Abbie. They had a powwow, a conference, lasted 3 days, but they did find Abbie Gardner, and she thankfully was rescued, taken to St. Paul over quite a long period of time. She was reunited with a sister that she had that was not in the cabin at the time of the massacre. And then Abbie got married that same summer, by the way, when she probably was still 13, and had 3 children, had a life, but then unfortunately got divorced, which was rather uncommon back in those days. And in 1891, she came back to visit the family homestead, the family log cabin, which had been inhabited by other folks and had been owned then by other people. But Abbie, when she saw that, was heartbroken because it was about ready to fall down. It had been undermined by water, and it again disturbed her greatly that this very, very important part of her past might just disappear. And so she had written a book that had sold quite well. She had some money available. And so here is another thing that is amazing, I think. Abbie bought the cabin. Abbie saved the cabin. So if you read about the cabin, it's now located in Arnold's Park. It still exists. You can tour it, you can go inside, and you can learn about everything related to what is called the Spirit Lake Massacre. That is because of Abbie, and Abbie alone. If she had not bought it and saved it, it undoubtedly would have been torn down or just fallen down. So Abbie's a heroine in my eyes in many ways. And Abbie then, from 1891 through the summer of 1920, was in the cabin. You can see this sign, one of the actual signs that Abbie had. She charged 25 cents to go through the cabin, $5 in today's money. And it was a way that she could support herself and also at the same time preserve the memories of those pioneers that had so many trials and tribulations back then. So Abbie then did something that I thought is extremely amazing. And I'm going to read this because I want to make it very, very clear as to what happened. Abbie, again, was becoming interested in Native American culture. And she was invited to give a presentation to a group of Native Americans in Pipestone, Minnesota. That was in 1892. And here's what Abbie told them. The Native Americans were anxious, worried perhaps about what Abbie would say, because their people back in 1857 had killed Abbie's whole family and taken her captive, and you know everything that had happened to Abbie. So there was a silence when Abbie got up to speak. And here's what Abbie said. Unbelievable, I think, but wonderful. Abbie says this to these Native Americans. Through the manifestation of Christ's Spirit, my former hatred toward Indians has changed to friendship and highest regard. I pledge to you my sympathy and kindness. She forgave them. Amazing. And here's the report in a newspaper. It says, murmurs spread through the audience. And spontaneously, they came forward to shake her hand and give Sue salutations, grace personified. And again, we can talk about the history of Abbie Gardner and what happened to the pioneers, and its significant history. But perhaps for each and every one of us, we can take away from Abbie's experiences and how she coped with them two things, among others. One is that she persevered, she kept going through amazing difficulty. And perhaps in all of our lives, we will have difficulties. And we can think of Abbie and how she did not give up. She persevered. And then the idea of forgiveness. Abbie personifies, I think, that concept of grace. And so the story, to me, is much more than history. It's a story of how we can react to difficulties in our own lives. Thank you.